gallery or go to search on here, you'll see it actually. It's the most popular or most downloaded extension. And it's actually a package of extensions. So this is something that is built actually by my team, and it's been a really nice way that we've been able to continue developing features after VS 2010 shipped, and then deliver them as extensions. So there's tons of features in there. I don't know, somewhere in the 15 to 16 or 17 range. So this is a nice way that we can continue to ship those out to you. Let's look at just a couple of those. One that's pretty nice down here, I'll just show you the keyboard shortcut so you know what I'm typing. Okay, so if I just go ahead and press that keyboard shortcut here, then you can see that that's going to really nicely align all of my assignments in that block. And it's doing it on the block level right now, but I could go ahead and do that up here as well. So just a nice way to visualize that code. Another one that I like here is holding down the control key. You can see that my code editor becomes filled with hyperlinks. So I can go ahead and click on any of these. And it's going to do an F12. It's just going to bring me to the definition. But it's just a kind of fun way to navigate around. And you can see that if I do actually have an HTTP address in my code, it will show as a hyperlink as well. And then I can control minus or just navigate backward. Okay, add reference dialog. This was one area where we get tons and tons of feedback. We did improve the performance. You can see that just popped up pretty quickly. We continue to work on improving performance there, but we also continue to work on making it even more usable. So you can see that I have a search box here, so it's pretty nice to be able to search for the reference that you're looking for. And then sometimes it's hard to distinguish between references, so this is one thing that's been added as well, is to add these check marks here so you can easily see what's been added and what hasn't. Another feature on one of the most recent versions of the Pro Power Tools is if I was targeting .NET Framework for client profile, previously we wouldn't show other DLLs that were not part of that profile. Now we'll show them grayed out, and you can actually, if you go to add them, then we'll just give you a warning and ask if you would like to change your target in order to include that reference. So some good enhancements happening in that space. And this is another one that's added in the most recent version. So you're probably all familiar with the find dialog, Control F, the kind of big clunky dialog that normally shows up. It goes on find replace. So let me go back to the quick find. Not sure what I'm running into here in 1 second. All right, somehow I have that loaded on that other instance, on this instance, but not over there, so let me jump over here for a second. Control F, what we're moving towards is a slicker, kind of more elegant find dialog. So it just comes up here in the top right. I can go ahead and type into it, and you can see that, you know, as I'm typing, I'm getting immediate feedback. I'm also getting indications in the scroll bar margin of the different occurrences that were found. So when I can quickly navigate to them here, I can also navigate between occurrences here, whatever you prefer. So speaking about the scroll bar margin, coming over here, there's a few different modes I can use here. Using just the regular scroll bar mode, you can see that I have these indicators for highlighted items, for the references. It will also show breakpoints, errors, lots of great code indicators here. And another interesting mode is the show map mode. So using that, I can come over here, and when I hover over the margin, and then it's actually giving me a visualization of the code at that location. So that's a nice way, you know, before navigating, I can go ahead and give a quick preview. Now the last one, show full mode, is also really nice. This is giving me a full visualization in the margin of the code file, so I can quickly, identify the structure and jump to it at a glance. So we're having a lot of fun with these Pro Power Tools, and hopefully you guys will get a chance to download them and try out the new features. Okay, so we saw a bunch of different tips for your Visual Studio environment. One is really taking advantage of those multiple monitors finally. The other was the refreshed UI that you have now with WPF. We saw how you can customize your start page. Then we also saw that Windows 7 integration with the jump list, control mouse zoom, and lots of extensions, including a bunch in the Pro Power Tools. Let me take a quick break now that we just finished that section and see if there are any questions on that section. If you want to go ahead and enter into the Q&A manager, then I'll take a few of those before I go on to the next one. Okay, there is a question about whether it supports horizontal scrolling. Unfortunately, I'm not sure which feature this was referring to. So, Ron, if you want to go ahead and put in a clarification, just because I didn't see this immediately when it popped up. Okay, and then in the meantime, anyone else have any other questions? I'll just take a brief break here. Okay, well, let's head back and keep going, and please do go ahead and enter in questions at any point, and I'll be sure to find breaks so we can go ahead and answer your questions. All right, so the next category of tips we wanted to talk about was tips for understanding the application. So I think that might be Ron in here. Okay, during text editing, does it, support a tilt wheel mouse to horizontally scroll. I don't think that we have anything new in terms of the tilt wheel mouse horizontal scrolling, so it would just be whatever support that we had previously. But I can go ahead and take a second look on that as well if you like afterwards. But no particular new features. Okay, so for understanding the application, it's most often you're working with an existing application, existing components. It's not all that often that you get to start on greenfield applications. So there's a lot of development time spent on this. Whether you come to a new job and you have to get up to speed with the code base there, or whether you're going to fix a bug and you have to remember the code that you wrote a couple years ago, or maybe just last week, or you're working in a component that you don't normally work in and understanding how that works. In the IDE, basically the way that we plan the features that we're going to add for each release is we look at all the different areas where you're spending time during your development, whether it's writing, refactoring, testing, debugging, and understanding is one that where a lot of time is definitely spent. So let's see some features you can use for these tasks. Okay, so first off, for this scenario of coming to a code base, such as the one that we're using today, and wanting to get a high-level view of what's going on, there's some nice features. There are a couple of them I'm going to show that are just available in Ultimate today. Most are actually available in Pro and Express, but I'll point out this is one of the two. So I'm going to go here to the Architecture menu, Generate Dependency Graph, Custom, and I've marked some custom settings here to specify what I want to model. And then this is going to go ahead and create a DGML graph. And it's going to give me a high-level view of my application and also show me the relationships. So I can hover over any of these lines, and it's going to show me the relationship between those two items. I can also zoom in on these graphs. I could print them out for my development team. There's a lot of different pre-configured views, so I can choose which view I like. There's a lot of customization you can do on what parts of the application you're modeling. That was a high-level view, but there's also even the Architecture Explorer, where I can get more granular and I can actually select which files I want to include, or which ones I want to not include. So the possibilities are pretty endless there. I can also do analysis on my application here. So if I right-click, there's a set of analyzers. So it's pretty nice to be able to just right-click and find any circular references in your application. That's a lot easier than doing it on your own. Similarly, unreferenced nodes, maybe I want to find out which code's not being called. Or in this case, let's go ahead and find the hubs, which is going to be the types that have the most connections. So, they're most centrally connected. That might be a good place for me to go ahead and dig into first as I'm getting up to speed with this application. So when I double-click, then it takes me to that type in code. A couple understanding features that we have here in code are, one, if I'm clicking next to a symbol, it's just going to go ahead and show me in a light highlighting other occurrences of the symbol, so I can quickly visualize how the variable is used in the method. And I can also Control-Shift down arrow to cycle through those, so it's kind of a navigation feature as well. Speaking about navigating, the next one is Edit Navigate To, or Control Comma is the most common way to invoke this. So this is used for navigation, but I think it's also interesting for understanding the app, so I can quickly search for all the .ps files, or we notice that this app is something about tweets, so this is showing me files and members in this view. So it's a quick way to search for them and also to navigate to them if I click on any of these. There's some nice search capabilities, got a few in here. So you see there's kind of a substring search going on, but there's also Pascal casing. So here I have open tweets from file. If I just want to get there pretty quickly, I can type the first letter of each word, and then it will show that result as well. So that's also true in IntelliSense in 2010. So if you want to go to console.readline and you just type a capital RL, that will filter to that item as well. So it's a nice quick way to get to what you're looking for. So let's navigate then from there. And the next thing we want to see is, now that we're looking at this method, when we go to make any change in here, we might want to know how this method is affecting other parts of our application. So what does the flow look like? What are the calls to this method, calls from? So to do that, I can right-click View Call Hierarchy. And that's going to bring up a new window down here where I can see calls to, calls from, and then I can click on that item. It's going to navigate to it and show the call type here as well. So I can, I can just keep going at this point, and I could then add that as a new route and see the calls to and from menu open. So, depending on what question you're trying to answer or what you're trying to solve, you can keep going down this control flow. And then to pitch the Pro Power Tools again, there's also a feature in Pro Power Tools where I can now just hover over the item, and then actually here in the tooltip I can see, let me go back to the item we were just looking at. Better here. Okay, so I can hover over here and then look at the called by and calls, and I find this is kind of a nice way just to jump around as well while I'm making a change, and go, if I have to go and make a change at the caller, then I can just go to the called by link and jump up there. So it's a nice way to move around and see what's going on. Okay, so now I'll show the second feature that's Ultimate only that I'm going to be showing today. Also super powerful. It is IntelliTrace Trace. So in terms of understanding application, you can see that there's new IntelliTrace window, which I can use to break at any point. And then here on the left gutter bar, I actually have these play buttons where I can now, you know, go forward and back, kind of like a video control. So let's go to the end here. So you know, going forward is something that we're used to previously, but being able to go ahead and step back is something that's pretty new in this release, and it's really powerful. So what's happening here is that Visual Studio is recording the history while you're debugging. And you can specify, there's tons of options here to specify, you know, if you want to record events only, events and call information, which events to record. You know, there's some things you need to consider when you're doing this, like maximum amount of disk space that you want to record. So there's this guy that's happening. There is a performance hit, but I think what you need to consider when you're using this tool is, you know, how much time would I be spending debugging the problem versus how much time I'm spending because my performance of my app might be a little bit slower. So what you'll want to do is, you know, when you encounter a problem, you know, go ahead and turn on IntelliTrace and then run it while you're diagnosing the issue, and then you might want to turn it off later. But it can be very useful anywhere from scenarios where, you know, the application is throwing an exception, being able to just go ahead and rewind. The way that we might think to do that previously would be to, you know, stop debugging, think about where the error might have occurred, go ahead and set a bunch of different breakpoints at those possible locations, go back and step through those. So now having the ability to just rewind and then view the variable values, you know, all that information is saved and stored, is really powerful. And then there's cases where, you know, you just F10 a little bit too fast, just one step over where you wanted to go, and then instead of having to stop and start debugging again, you can just rewind. So some interesting capabilities for that. And then finally, one tried and true way to understand an application is always to run it. So let's go ahead and run this app that we've been working with and see what it does. So this is a program that I wrote for part of my job. So as community program manager, there's kind of two aspects of what I do. One is the outbound content part of the job, so things like you know, presentations like this, a lot of our work at conferences and events, the MSD and developer centers, etc. And then the other half is bringing feedback back to the team that we can use for our product planning. So we do that in many forms, whether it's forums or comments that we receive a lot of feedback from the MVP programs. We manage the C# and MVP programs. And then finally, on early releases, the challenge is that we want to get feedback early, obviously. We want to find out pretty quickly what we need to change before the next RC or whatever the next release may be. And so we've actually found Twitter to be an interesting place where we can get some quick feedback. It's not as detailed, obviously, as something like a Connect bug report, but you know, we do identify some issues here. And so I started searching for VS 2010 after each of the early releases to see if I can identify what's going on. But I've also found this tool to be interesting to analyze trends about, you know, whatever topic you're interested in. So here I just did a search for LIDNUG, and now we can see what people are saying about the group. But often what would happen is that rather than, there were often like thousands of tweets to go through, and rather than read all of them, then usually I would want to find out what the trends are. So what this part of the application is doing is essentially counting the word count of each of the unique words that appears in these tweets, and then finding out the number of times that it occurs. And then it's just showing it here in order. So, so now I can go ahead and dig into the trends. So I can see, what people are saying about the previous LIDNUG talk on Orchard, or what the buzz is about tips and tricks, or where I can go for downloads. So kind of a fun way to dig in there. And then finally, at the end of doing that analysis, usually what I wanted to do was share the feedback with the team so we could incorporate it into our plans. And so next I'll generate a nice chart from Excel that I could format, or maybe I want to actually do some charting and see over time when the downloads were occurring. So here's the link for this tool if you want to go ahead and download it for your own trend searching. Maybe you want to see what people are saying about your favorite sports team or your company. Go ahead and give it a shot. Okay, so let me see. We'll go back to slides for just a moment, and then I'll check the Q&A manager. So in terms of understanding the application, lots of interesting tools you can use. The first, the directed graph markup language graphs. So these were the ones where we were able to view the high-level architecture of the application. Again, that could be a lot more detailed as well, depending on what you want to include in your graph, and ability to do a lot of analysis on the application there as well. Then we saw the highlight references, where I could, if my cursor was on a symbol, then I could quickly visualize the other occurrences of the symbol in that file. Navigate to is the control comma command that brought up that simple dialog where I could just quickly search for files or members. We saw call hierarchy, which is currently C# only, but rapidly being developed for VB as well. We saw IntelliTrace, and then I'll show VB type colorization just in the next section. So if there's any questions on that section, I'll go ahead and switch over. Cool. So Brian's going to take advantage of this Twitter tool. Any other questions? People want to know more about those features? Okay, so where do you access that BJML tool? So that was here in the architecture menu, generate dependency graph, and then you can use one of the predefined graph parameters, or you can use a custom one. And when you go to custom, then you can specify what kinds of numbers to include and accessibility modifiers, etc. So of the features that I showed, the two that were for Ultimate only were that modeling graph that I showed and IntelliTrace, the rewind while debugging. So yeah, same question. Those were two features exactly, Peter, that you called out. Those are the two that are, unfortunately, they're not in VS Professional. Those are in the highest SKUs. So in the business, we have to kind of rationalize the value between the different SKUs, and what often gets moved up to the highest ultimate SKU is some of the most powerful features, the ones with the really deep analytics. So you'll see the modeling and diagnostics. So, a lot of those features end up in the highest SKU. Okay, so with that, let's get back to some more tips. Okay, so we talked about lots of different tasks that you have to do during development. Of course, you need to write code as well. Let me see, there's a couple questions in here. Will the presentation be available for on-demand viewing and download? Yes, I believe the LIDNUG team does this for all of the presentations, so I'd be happy for them to do it for this one as well. Do you know of any modeling add-ins that could compensate? Gosh, you know, I can't think of one offhand here. I'm sure that you could probably find some extensions on the gallery that do, you know, different parts of what I showed. There's probably not something that has the all-inclusive set of modeling features there, including there's also UML diagrams and other things that I didn't have the opportunity to show in the scope of this presentation. But for modeling, I'm sure there's a couple things you could find up there, whether free or paid. So I would just go ahead and give it a search and see, you know, depending on what your preferences are and what particularly you want to add in, see what you can find up there. Can you show us how to install the Pro Power Tools if it fails? That's a bummer. I actually just installed the latest update last night, so let's see what was going on there. So a couple ways you can do it. One would be to come over to Visual Studio Gallery. So here I'm just here on the main page, and then if you go to the most popular tab here, you'll see Productivity Power Tools from Microsoft. So I'll click there, and then it's just this download button here. And that'll download into your, I'm not sure what it's going to do because I already have it, or actually it will detect that I already have it installed. It's a V6 file, the VSIX, that's the, yeah, it's detecting that it's already installed. But essentially it'll go through the V6 installer. It's a very quick installer. It just says, do you want to install this extension? Yes, and that puts it into your Visual Studio experience. The other way to do it in here would be to go to the Tools Extension Manager and then go to the Online Gallery. And then here you can see I can choose if I want to select by highest ranked or most downloads. And then it should be right up here at the top. It actually shows me with that green mark that the extension's already installed. But from here, anyway, from here you should be able to click and, yeah, so if I go to one that I haven't installed and when I click on it, it gives me a download option. And beyond that, if you are running into issues installing it, please do go ahead and submit a bug or send me a mail afterwards, and we'll look into that. One nice thing about the Extension Manager is that it does track updates. So for the Pro Power Tools, for example, we continue to deliver updates. We're on, I think it's something like the 6th update that we've had since the first release, which was shortly after 2010 went out, beginning of last year. So it'll just quickly register the update here, and then now that I've installed Pro Power Tools once, when there's an update, additional features added, then I'll just get it here through the Update Manager. So that's also something to consider, extensions that your users will get to benefit from this experience as well as you update your extension. Okay, great. Well, I'll be pretty quick here. Basically, we talked about a lot of different parts of the development process. Writing code is obviously a huge and important one. So let's go into some tips now on the C#, Visual Basic languages, and then also some really interesting innovations in the .NET framework. And as I do this, what I'll do is I'll basically show the process that I used of building this application while using all of these .NET 4 features. So this is the WPF application that you saw earlier. One of the first features I want to show here is how you can actually generate code without writing it yourself. And that's through the drag and drop data binding that we have available now for WPF and Silverlight. This is something that we introduced in the 2005 release for WinForms. And it's just a really nice time saver. So let me show you how that works. Basically, I wanted to data bind this data grid to the tweet object. So you saw when that form populated that it showed, a series of individual tweets. So what I'll do is come over here to data, add new data source, and this experience is exactly like it is in WinForms if you've tried that before. So there's a variety of different data sources I can get the data from. Here it's going to be from an object, and then I'll have to specify which object. So I'll just go into my application and find the tweet class. Okay, and so then at this point, it's been added, and I can go to show the data sources, and I see the tweet object. I can specify if I want to display it in a list details view or in a data grid. Here we're doing a data grid. And then based on the type of the members, it's giving its best guess of the UI element that should show the member. So here it's showing as a text box. It was guessing time as, let's see, some kind of label. So we'll do that as a text box also to be consistent. And then this last part I'm not going to actually do because I've already done the binding. But basically you can see how the mouse is kind of lighting up on different UI elements that I could bind this object to. So I would just drop it here into the data grid view. And what that would do is basically generate these lines of XAML, so I wouldn't have to write those myself. And then that would specify each of the column names when they're binding, the headers, etc. And then the last part that I have to do to hook up this binding in this method. Okay, so at any point, what I do is I have this list of tweets that I'm maintaining at any given point about the results that I want to have displayed. And so then I just set the tweet data grid item source to that collection. And that's my data binding. So let's look at that tweet class a little bit more closely, and I'll show off some of the new VB features there. So what you'll see here is I go through the VB and C# features is that we're filling in a couple of the gaps on either side and bringing them closer to parity. So for the C# guys on the line, when you see the VB features, it's going to be kind of like, well, we've had that for a couple of releases. And the VB guys are going to have the same experience as when we show the C# features. You're going to have those already since before .NET, some of them. So you'll see those evening out. So the first one I wanted to show for Visual Basic is the auto-implemented properties. Here you can see this is my tweet class. It's nice and simple, as it should be. I just have these 3 properties. I can see the different, oops, my tooltip getting a little aggressive. I can see the property names and their type. Previously, I can still write this class definition, I can still define properties in this expanded syntax now. You can see this code is still compiling, but I don't need to. So the way I would have probably done this before is using the property snippet. That's the quickest way to generate all this code. In case folks haven't used that, the idea is that you just type a few characters, see it in IntelliSense, and then I can tab twice to insert the snippet and go ahead and insert my values, etc. But the idea here is that in this syntax, really it's a lot of boilerplate code, and all the interesting information is right here. So in cases like this where I'm not doing any customization in my getter or setter, it's just the default behavior, then what we've enabled is for you to just write the property using just those few words that have all the information we need to generate this in the compiler. That's the change there. For the C# folks that might have tuned out, I'm going to fill in with a feature that's relevant to both. So this next one is block selection. I'll type out the keyboard shortcut here as well. Let's back in BD. Okay, so shift +0. So I can either use the keyboard shortcut, or I can also, with my mouse, just hold down the Alt key. Okay, and what that's going to do is allow me to create a block selection. And so let's just create a really skinny one. And when I do that, then I can start to actually type on multiple. That can help you code a little bit more quickly. It's interesting for cases like this, you know, where you want to add modifiers to multiple lines at once. I don't know, it's kind of a funny feature, but I found that once I started using different cases for it, like the one that we just saw, or another one in Visual Basic would be if you have a with statement and then you want to go ahead and take that with variable and actually prefix it to all of the, you know, you want to remove the with statement but keep the code compiling, you could put that variable name on multiple lines at once. I don't know, have some fun with it. Okay, let's see, another VB feature. Okay, so everybody knows about the line continuation character in Visual Basic, which we need to use to continue lines. It can get pretty tedious to type. It's also just a little bit annoying to read. So why don't we go ahead and just replace it with a space. So now let's replace there after a comma, after a dot here, after, you know, in a query, that would, particularly here, once we had queries where you're writing multi-line statements quite often, you know, you're always having to write this line continuation. It was kind of annoying to remember. And then we added XML literals to Visual Basic, which don't require line continuations, fortunately, because that would have been really annoying to have to, when you copy over your XML into your VB application, to add underscores to the end of each line. But then it makes it kind of confusing now to know, you know, when in this query do I need line continuations and when don't I? So now we can just remove them. After binary operators, I can get rid of them. After commas, arguments or parameter lists, etc. Another one would be after attributes. It's a common place to forget them as well. So I think it's 99% of cases now where we remove the need for line continuation. There are a couple where it's ambiguous. It's kind of a hard compiler problem actually to know. You know, we don't have semicolons in Visual Basic, so we have to be able to figure out when the line ends as well. So there's a couple interesting cases, like if you have a query which ends in select, and then you have a select case statement following it, we have to require a line between them so we can distinguish them. But otherwise, you know, you saw about 99% of the cases cannot be solved after line continuation. Okay, PD feature. What I was going to mention here are the type colorizations that are happening here, which we also had previously for feature art. Okay, the last one I was going to show here was statement lambdas, which came in handy because I was, oh gosh. All right, so I have a few things installed on this machine. I actually was doing a presentation last week where I had I have the async CCP installed, and then I also have the Roslyn project, which is, you know, kind of after the next version of Visual Studio. So I have several things going on the same machine here, and I have seen that crash once before. Well, let me bring up Visual Studio again. What I was going to talk about here was that there were some cases where I wanted to handle errors in my application. So, for example, when I was going to access Twitter, there were cases where I wouldn't get results back. So, for example, if I wasn't connected to the internet, then I wouldn't get tweets returned. But there were also cases where I had just exceeded my Twitter limit, or I was on the Microsoft network and it was viewing all Microsoft addresses with the same IP and thinking that I had exceeded my Twitter limit. So I wanted to be able to catch some of these errors to understand what the problem was when I didn't get any information returned. And so that's what I did here, was basically when I have a load error, then I wanted to call this method to print out a message box with the error message. And so what I would have had to do previously is basically write this helper method down here and then call the address of that method in my in this add handler statement. Instead, rather than writing this extra method, just show it here, and kind of polluting my code by having all these little helper methods, you know, it's just a really simple statement that I want to achieve here. Is just this one line. So I can just do that in line now using the statement lambdas. And there's kind of a nice editing experience for these as well. Just show that. So you can see this is the multi-line experience. It really feels like you're just writing a Visual Basic method in line. Okay, so I'm going to use that as a lead-in to the next feature that we're going to talk about, which is a framework feature that really relied upon this support for lambdas. So let me switch back now to my C# version. But again, this stuff is all applicable in both. Okay, let me find the line we're looking for here. Okay, so next I want to talk about asynchronous and parallel programming. And there are a lot of features in .NET Framework 4 for these kind of scenarios. So in .NET 4 you have the task parallel library, you have plink, you have new concurrency data structures, you have profiling tools. For C++, there's the new concurrency runtime. So lots of framework features to help support the scenario, which we're finding, you know, more and more important with clusters and distributed computing and all the different scenarios that we're dealing with in programming today. So we're going to look at a couple examples of those. The first one we'll look at is the task parallel library. And the scenario here is that there were a lot of cases when I had my UI up, but I was doing some kind of I/O or computation, and I didn't want my my UI to hang while I was doing that work. So I wanted to do the work asynchronously so that someone could still interact with the application while that was going on, and it wouldn't look like the whole thing had frozen. So what I used was .NET 4 tasks in order to make that work run asynchronously. And you can see that here where I'm starting a new task. And the scenario here is when I was generating the trends. So basically going through and doing those calculations of the word counts. So this is the button that gets clicked to generate trends. And then the work is actually happening here in the process collection method. And I have two versions of it based on whether this checkbox is switched on or not, just for demo purposes to show this example. So I can either process the collection in parallel or not, and we'll see that part in just a moment. But for the sake of the task example, we just need to know that the work is happening in this line. So I want to do this work as part of the task. So that's what I'm doing here. And these other lines here are just setting up and starting the stopwatch so I can register those differences. And then here is my continuation. So there's a set of work that I want to make sure only happens once this work completes. So I only want to update the tag cloud and show these results once I have them. I could have actually had a different behavior there. I could have kind of shown it while it was calculating, but in this case, I only wanted to show the UI, or this is an example, like the final time, I only want to show once the operation, oh, I guess I could have shown that on the way too. Anyway, in this case, I just showed the final results after the calculations were done, so that happens in my continuation. So this is the way that the syntax works for tasks. And so as you can see, we really needed lambdas. That's actually one of the driving forces for having this parity in language features between C# and VB, is that as these different frameworks and platforms come out, we want to make sure that you can use either one to be successful on them. So we have to make sure we have all the same language support. So as far as this scenario, it's actually one that we're continuing to work on in the language for the next version after Visual Studio 2010. So I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But for now, let's look at what how you would do this in 2010. So as far as why you would use a task here rather than spin up a new thread to do this work, is that tasks are going to provide a lot of optimizations and do a lot of the work for you. You could do this.
Let him down. They're not responding to his request for information concerning criminal illegal immigrants who are released.
Wow. Okay, I think that's considered an off-topic.
So is that the same time as it?
Okay. So talking about threading, we'll get away from the criminal stuff. Some things that you'll get from using a task as opposed to starting up your own thread here would be an optimization such as, when you go ahead and deploy this application, what's the optimal number of threads to run? Well, it's going to depend on the number of cores on the machine you're deploying to. It's going to depend on what other processes are running at that time. So what tasks are doing is they're using the .NET thread pool, and they will, answer those questions on the different machines where this is deployed. So just one of the things that you get out of using tasks. So that's what we're using here. So then let's look into this other method. I'll use my Control-click to go to the definition. So here, remember, we have two examples of process collection. So these queries are the ones that are getting my word counts for me. And one of them is going to be happening sequentially, and the other one is in parallel. And so if you take a look at these two queries, you can try to figure out what's different between the two. And so you might notice that it's a very small difference. Basically, we just add as parallel to the source, whatever is in our from statement, and that's all you need to do to make these operations run in parallel. So the idea here is that you could use tasks where, on each iteration of a loop, you could do that on a separate task. But the .NET team went ahead and saw some of the very common tasks, or common scenarios, for parallelization, and just made those as easy as possible to do. So it's pretty incredible that you can just specify as parallel on a link query and make it run in parallel. Another scenario that they enabled is for and for each loops. Those are also very common candidates for parallelization. And so there, instead of using for each, you can just use parallel.for or parallel.for each and include the necessary imports and references, obviously. But yeah, really a great step in the right direction to make this kind of programming easier. Okay, I'm going to switch back into our next language topic, but let me just see if there's some questions here. Okay. Do only extensions that are available for your version of VS show in the gallery? Are they marked by version? That's a good question. So I think okay, there's a couple of ways you could define version. In VS Gallery, you can filter the version of Visual Studio in terms of year of Visual Studio, so 2005, 2008, 2010, and I believe that we will check on the install. I'd have to verify to be 100% sure, but I'm like 95% sure that we will check to make sure that when you double click on that V6 file that you have the right version number available, because we do have the ability to detect that information. As far as versions, if you were talking about SKUs, extensions are not available for the Express queue, but otherwise they will install into Pro and anything higher. So again, that will kind of automatically be detected as well. Can you select a word and replace all of its instances without leaving the code screen? So, yeah, so not sure what the best way is to show this here, but the example would be basically if I went to do the Control F, hey, now it's working in C#. Anyway, that's why these things are sometimes extensions, and we still have a little bit of work to do before they come into RTM, but Control F is now bringing up my nice, elegant find and replace dialog instead of the clunky one in C# as well. So I think that's what you're looking for. So I'm within the code editor, and I can do my find and replace. And there's also keyboard shortcuts that you can use so that you can make sure not to leave the keyboard for that one. For a developer, what are the must-have extensions? Well, that's part of my goal in showing some of these extensions here is what are the features or extensions that I'm using the most. I have a blog draft that I'm planning to put together on some of those because I think it's a pretty common question. But I showed a bunch of them today as far as the ones that I'm using. As far as trying to get a sense of, what people are using across the board, I would just go to the gallery and, go down the list in terms of highest downloads, and usually those are pretty good ones. So, yeah, those are a few different ideas to think about which extensions you want to load into your IDE. All right, let's switch back for another language framework topic, which is the DLR. So the dynamic language runtime was added in .NET 4, and it includes a number of components. So one is expression trees. Those are building upon the expression trees that we had for LINQ. The other one is dynamic dispatch, and we'll see on the next slide what that means exactly. And finally, call site caching, which is some caching that we need in order to allow for reliable performance in the dynamic dispatch scenarios. The DLR supports a number of languages. They're both dynamic and static languages that I can use to call into the DLR. And it's an open, extensible platform, so third parties can also create languages on the DLR. And what's really powerful is that it allows you to bind to a variety of different objects in a really uniform way. So I can bind to .NET static objects. This is kind of common sense for C# and VB. This is what you do all the time. But for dynamic languages like Iron Python and Iron Ruby, it's pretty cool to be able to call into the .NET framework. It also includes JavaScript binders, important in Silverlight scenarios, Python and Ruby binders, COM binders for Office, for example, etc. And so what do we mean by dynamic dispatch? Here's the story here. Let's look at an example for what we mean by static binding before we look at dynamic binding. So static binding is what we use commonly today, right? We can create a variable called calc. We can call get calculator, and we know what type that method returns. So we can assign a variable type calculator. We can even do type inference there. On the next line, we can then call a member of calculator because we know what that type definition looks like. We also know the definition for add. We know it takes 2 parameters, and we know what type it returns. So kind of straightforward. But let's consider that we're calling get calculator, and maybe it's returning a response from the web. We don't know exactly what type is coming back. So what I would do in the Visual Basic case is I would use late binding, so I could create the return variable as type object, and that will kind of wait until runtime in order to determine what type that actually is. On the C# side, we didn't have a language construct to kind of defer that compilation. Instead, we would get, a design time compiler error if I tried to guess what type it was. So instead, I would have to do reflection. And so here you can see that we're returning a type object, and then we're actually invoking this member add because we don't know if add exists. We're passing in an argument array. We're doing this conversion back to int in the end. And then on the VB side, we just call calc.add. And because we know that we're doing late binding there, we just defer that lookup until runtime. So we won't throw an error at design time because add's not available on an object. We'll just defer that determination until runtime. And then binding to JavaScript objects has the same kind of problem of having it invoke the member methods and conversions. This experience is the same for C# and VB. And then what we're doing in 2010 is basically allowing the same experience for both C# and VB through all these different types of objects, where the model is a little bit different between the two. Basically, the late binding that you can think of from VB is also occurring here in C#, but it's actually just scoped to the current variable. So whereas for VB, you use compiler options to specify that late binding is possible for the entire file. You can also do it for the project, but the file is as granular as you can get. For C#, it's going to be scoped to that variable that you've typed dynamic, and then that tells the compiler to defer that evaluation until runtime. Okay, so let me switch to a demo because you might wonder, why would you ever need this? So I'll show an example. I actually have a version of this application on my desktop. Okay, so let's do our usual LIDNUG query. And the example that I'm going to show here is one where you can use dynamic languages as scripting languages. And that's one of the most interesting scenarios, I think, for doing this kind of interop between static languages like C# and VB and dynamic languages like Python I'm going to use here. And what scripting, a kind of scenario that scripting is nice for is for providing some additional extensibility of your application. So we talked about the extensibility of Visual Studio, and we have a whole team working on extensibility. So it's a lot of work to make your app extensible. But let's say that you're a small ISV and you don't want to, you don't have the resources to provide a huge extensibility framework. You might just want to let people script against your app a bit. So let's see, we have this filtering feature here in my application. So I can filter down results, and this is searching within the message to find a word like Lisa Feig. Well, let's say as a user I want to start doing additional searching in here. So let's say I want to search in just the user. I don't want to see the words that a tweet's mentioning my name. I want to see the ones that I actually wrote myself. So now I'm just writing, this is some Python code here. It's a very simple expression. It could, looks like it could be in other languages as well. And what I put up here is a Python interpreter. So now I can just process Python on the results, and now it's going to find just the items where I'm the user. So another example is, I can type any Python expression here. So you can just think about any kind of regular expression. For example, I might want to type. So maybe I want to do something like, so I want to find all the tweets that have something to do with my name. Maybe I'll look to see if someone wrote my last name, or I'll see if, you know, they wrote my alias. Okay. And then process that Python. Oh gosh. I am not having the best of luck. I've never even seen that error before. Okay, let me recoup this. So we don't have to search again. Let's just bring up a result. And let me try something simple. Okay, so we got that part. Let's see what happened to our last query. Okay, well, I don't know what I did differently exactly, but anyway, you can see that this kind of search is now working here. So I have, you know, instances where there was just my last name in the tweet, and then I have instances where it says Lisa Feig. And again, the possibilities here are endless of, you know, all the different Python expressions I could have put in here. So I'm going to show this briefly in the code, but we're starting to run out of time, and I have a few more C# features, jeez Louise, that we want to show. So let me switch over. Okay. Okay. So this is the button that I had hooked up that did that work to hook up the Python interpreter. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm setting the current directory to the IronPython libraries that I have installed. So what you have to install to get this to work is you have .NET 4 on your machine, and then also install the IronPython libraries. There's a compatible version there. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to spin up the Python interpreter engine. That's the engine that's actually going to evaluate the Python code. In this next line, we're defining this variable script source that's actually taking the text from the text box. So this is really cool. This is where we're actually injecting code into our application while it's running, which is also dangerous. Obviously, if I was putting this in a production app, I would have specified app domain so that, you know, I had very clear access and the user couldn't put in an expression that was going to delete my hard drive. But this is a demo app I'm kind of using personally, and you can use as well. But before you go ahead and take that code and put it into a product, you might want to safeguard it a little bit more. But in any case, the power is interesting and exciting. So then, of course, to evaluate that expression, I need some kind of scope. So I need to know the environment variable. So here's my scope variable, and it's dynamic because I want to be able to inject into it at any time, specify members, so I can build up the scope for the evaluation. Now we have a list of tweets that we're going to be putting our results into. And then we're going to cycle through the results list in the, let's see, attempting to restore our connection. Let me know if anyone's having trouble seeing the screen. Okay, so we're going to cycle through our results. And then here's where we're going to actually inject the current tweet, so the current, you know, particular Twitter message that we're going to analyze. We're going to inject that into the scope. And then we're going to execute our source, so something like Lisa Feig tweet.message, against that scope and see whether it evaluates to true or false, whether that string is in that tweet. And this expression, this evaluation is happening in Python, but here I have a C# if statement. So that's all being done by the DLR, which is really interesting, where it's taking a Python Boolean and then doing the conversion here for C#. And if it comes out to true, then I add it to my temp list, and then in the end, I display the results. So that's the work that's done here. Okay, last set of C# features that I want to make sure to mention here. I showed, these are some language features. They can be used in a variety of scenarios. I'm going to show them here in kind of an office or comm scenario, because that's a pretty common one. So you saw the case where at the end I exported that Excel file. Here's some C# language features I was able to use while I was building that part of the application. Comm APIs sometimes take a lot of parameters, and often you don't necessarily want to pass them. They're optional parameters. In this case, I'm using the add API, which just takes one, but previously I would have had to pass in system.type.missing because the C# language didn't support optional parameters yet, but now it does, and so now I can just leave this blank. So for those APIs that require, or that have about 15 or 16 optional parameters, folks who are doing comm development are really, really happy to see this here. Another one is index properties. So formerly I couldn't call a property from C# that took an argument. So instead I would have had to do something like call the equivalent method and then pass the argument there. So here I can just call this property directly. Okay, another case of index properties I'm going to skip through because we're running short on time. And then finally, this is another case where these comm APIs are now going to return dynamic, so I don't need to do this cast anymore. So a couple places where I was able to use C# language features. One other enhancement I want to point out for comm is that one pain point previously was with primary interop assemblies. Here I was using Microsoft.office.interop.excel for my Excel part of the app. And these PIAs, is what you call them for short, are very bulky and can add a lot of size to your deployment. So the change that we've done now is we've added this property called embed interop types. We default it to true now. And what that does is, rather than making you deploy the entire PIA, we're going to actually evaluate which types you're using from this reference, and then you only have to deploy, and then we're going to embed those types into your output. So instead of having to, just open this folder, instead of seeing the office.interop.excel assembly here, we're not going to see that anymore. Instead, it's going to be embedded. So that cuts down on the size of your deployment, and it also helps with versioning because as you're deploying to different machines, you have a little bit more flexibility on what version of Office is there. So let me get back here. So we saw a lot of different features for writing code. We saw the WPF drag and drop feature you can use to generate some of that XAML for you. The block selection typing is always fun, where you can hold the Alt key and type on multiple lines at once. Then we looked at the task parallel library and plink in .NET 4 and the DLR and dynamic language interop. And then we also looked at a lot of these VB and C# language features. So we saw a bunch of features that were formerly in C# that are now added to Visual Basic. And then we saw a bunch of features that were formerly in VB and now added to C#. And then we saw the new features. Going forward, what we're doing is adding those both together. So we saw tips on all these different themes. And what I'd like to do for the last couple minutes is, oftentimes when I talk about VS 2010, or when I go out and speak, now people want to know from the product team what is coming next. So let me say a few words about that as well, about the horizons after VS 2010. I talked a little bit about how we decide what IDE features to do by looking at the tasks that are requiring the most time. making you more productive there. So that's what we're trying to do with the Pro Power tools as well. In addition to allowing us to deliver additional value after the release, we're also using that to try out features very early that we're considering for vNext. So you will see some of those features actually come into the next version of Visual Studio. And therefore, I encourage you to download it so you can give your feedback and make sure that they work best for your development. Okay, these next three trends, declarative, dynamic, and concurrent, are what we've been identifying as trends that we see in development and programming today, and what we're using to help determine what we put into the C# and VB languages to help address those trends. So declarative is the idea that you see, like with LINQ, for example, where rather than having to painstakingly describe exactly what the compiler should do, stating at a higher level what you want the program to do, and then letting the compiler do the details for you. So that's kind of a design philosophy that we're using. We saw several needs for working with dynamic objects. So you saw how the work that we were doing in 2010 to address that. And then finally, concurrency, you saw all the work that's been done in the framework, and what we're doing in the next version of Visual Studio is actually building upon that. You saw when I went to use a task to do that work asynchronously and keep my UI responsive, that I had to kind of convolute my code in order to write it in that Lambda. And so what we've come up with is a new syntax that allows you to really lightly kind of decorate your code and specify which lines you want to run asynchronously without having to specify the continuation. That just gets figured out for you. So that's coming, and we have a CTP out, which I'll point you to in a moment. And then finally, looking further out, the other product that I have installed on this machine is something that is a long lead project called Roslyn, which is where we're rewriting the C# and Visual Basic compilers in C# and Visual Basic. And with those managed APIs, we're enabling a whole new set of scenarios where we're giving third parties much deeper access into the language, where they can now start to just call the compiler as a service. That's how we came up with that name. We can just call an API to say, what are all the members in scope at this time? And that's going to allow for some really great innovation on the extensions, kind of things that we saw earlier. We'll see those getting richer and developed even faster. We've seen it speed up the development of IDE features in the product itself. And it's also helping us create a redeveloped print loop experience in the product, which is a nice window. We actually have this in F# today, the F# interactive window, where you can quickly type lines of code and have them evaluated there. So without further ado, those are some of the top resources I would point you to. Our developer centers on MSDN, and from there you can get the async CTP. And thank you guys so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. I think, probably the next thing to do would be to come back and talk in more detail about our plans for the next version of Visual Studio and talk about the async work that we're doing in C# and VB and maybe even Roslyn. So I'll keep in touch with Invar and Brian on that. Otherwise, here's my contact info and my blog. And then, Brian, just let me know if we want to take these questions, or I know we're getting close to the end, so let me know what you want to do.
Yeah, sure. If you have time to for the last couple of questions, by all means.
Okay. Actually, I checked the Q&A manager. It looks like there are 3 there, but we actually answered these previously, so we are all complete. So if you have additional questions, feel free to contact me through my blog. But otherwise, thanks for joining, and thanks to Brian for organizing.
Not a problem. Thank you very much, Lisa, and definitely thank you for that Twitter analysis tool. I think that can come in quite handy, to be honest.
Cool.
And you're right. I think next step will be to get you back to talk about what's coming up in the next version of Visual Studio. I think we're definitely going to take you up on that offer. And then we will see you again, I hope, in the very, very near future.
Sounds good.
All right, guys. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. As usual, the recording will be available at www.lidnug.org/archive.